Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am here with Shannon O'Keefe, and we are so excited to be here. I'm so excited to have her here. Actually, she's an attorney at Johnson Law Group, and she is just a wealth of knowledge with everything custody and family law related. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her, and she is going to share a ton of information for you guys. Just a reminder, at the end, we do have questions and answers. If you think of any questions along the way, feel free to type them into your chat box and I can read them out at the end. Your participation and registration is anonymous, so feel free to ask away. There are no boundaries here. Shannon, I'm going to let you take it over.
Okay, let's see here. Thanks everybody for joining our webinar today. And thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I am really excited to start discussing our issues today, which is going to be navigating multi-state parenting plans. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that you all can see this. Sarah, can you confirm that this has now shared appropriately?
Yes, it's beautiful. Love the green.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, green's my favorite color, so I like going that route. Okay, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about navigating multi-state parenting plans, but before we get started, I just want to make it clear that this presentation is not to be construed as legal advice, and it does not create an attorney-client relationship. I am, however, very happy to have all of you here and look forward to discussing this topic and any questions that you might have after we're done. So starting with our important logistical considerations, the questions that we're trying to answer today all surround what to do, what arises when parents live in different states. The factors listed here should be considered when fashioning the terms of your multi-state parenting plan. And we'll go through each of these considerations in more detail, but I want to first address the question of why they're important. You'll have to keep in mind that you and your co-parent can always be flexible with one another. If you talk and you agree to a temporary or one-time change to your parenting plan, that's absolutely fine. For example, your default exchange time per your parenting plan might be 7 p.m. on Tuesdays. You might decide that next week, however, you'd like to conduct the exchange on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Great. The parenting plan is there in the event that you can't reach agreements when someone requests a temporary deviation or change. In those cases, let's say parent number one makes the Wednesday at 3 p.m. request. If parent two disagrees, then the terms of your parenting plan control. The exchange by default will take place on Tuesday at 7 p.m. as per usual. Even if you and the other party have a good co-parenting relationship and you think, well, we'll always be flexible with one another, it is a relationship that will continue to develop and change throughout your kids' lives. And we always hope that this relationship will change for the better, that you're going to build trust, respect, and understanding, and you'll be able to handle disputes and disagreements civilly. However, we always say that we want to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And the worst is that you and your co-parent have a dispute about how to exercise your parenting time that can't be resolved civilly and that you can't resolve by relying on the provisions of your parenting plan. In those cases, you're fighting with your co-parent and you're likely going to need to seek court intervention, which is time-consuming, stressful, and if you have an attorney, it can be expensive. So the advantage of considering these logistical issues is that you can hopefully avoid coming back to court by drafting on the front end something that's really comprehensive. And the reason that the details are extra important in a multi-state parenting plan is because of the number of logistical considerations that go into how you and your co-parent are going to be sharing parenting time. So the first thing that we'll talk about is how to define parenting time. There are generally 4 types of parenting time: school year and summer, which can fall under the general umbrella of regular parenting time. Then you also have holiday and vacation time. In a multi-state parenting plan, it's almost never feasible for both parents to share the school year. So it becomes necessary to divide the calendar year between school year and summer parenting time, with one parent having the majority of time during the school year and the other parent having the majority of time in the summer. However, that breakdown usually isn't on its own sufficient to meet the Colorado legislature's declaration that we should be encouraging and supporting frequent and regular contact between a child and both their parents. So we have to get creative on how we allocate overnights, specifically holiday parenting time and special weekends. And while vacation parenting time does have a role to play in multi-state parenting plans, it won't be our focus of today because of the relatively low impact on how we allocate overnights between both parents. Starting off here with the school year versus summer parenting time, this is what I'd like to talk about first because it is the most important and usually the thing that parents think about first when they're talking about a multi-state parenting plan. Here's an example. Actually, let me go back one here. Here's an example of some bad or insufficient language to use in your parenting plan. It does accomplish a very general allocation of overnights, but red flags are going to go up in my head because I start pretending like I'm dealing with a very difficult co-parent and how they might try to manipulate this very vague provision to frustrate our original intentions. So I want to go to our good example. And you'll note that our good example is much longer and consists of three, we'll call them parts. 3 parts. Starting with part number 1, you'll note a couple of things here. We're trying to define what the school year is and what the summer is. With this language, you note that we now have a very clear understanding of when the school year is going to start and when it's going to end, and when the summer starts and ends, because you have that 7-day language prior to and following each break. This allows you to look at the child's academic calendar each year and pinpoint a day where the school year ends and the summer begins. You also have a time on the specific day where the child transitions from being with parent 1 and parent 1's responsibility to being parent 2's responsibility. With this language, it's much harder to manipulate the provision. There's very little wiggle room, if any. So this is going to help you define what the summer means, what the school year means. Let's go to part 2 of our good example. Part 2 of our good example, we want to define who is the majority time parent in the school year and who's the majority time parent during the summer. The reason for this language will largely become clear, I guess, in part number 3 on the next slide and the slide where we discuss holidays. It's not going to be a straight 9-month period during the school year where your child is with parent 1, let's say that's dad in our example, and 3 months with mom during the summer, where the non-majority time parent in each of those seasons is not going to get to see the child. There's likely going to be carve-outs for the non-majority time parent during the other parent's time, so that we encourage and support the frequent and regular contact between the child and both of their parents. So let's go to part 3 here. Part 3, it contemplates that we want to define what parenting time, if any, the non-majority parent will have during the other person's time. So during the school year, remember that we contemplated in our example that dad would be the majority time parent. Assuming the school year is 9 months, we probably need to carve out some time for mom to see the child on a semi-regular basis. So this example allows mom to see the child once per month while the child is in school. And we define what those weekends look like, the once per month weekends. We don't just say it is a weekend. It has to be a specific one. We've chosen the 3rd weekend of the month. You can choose the 1st, the 2nd, the 4th, whatever works best for you. And then we define what the weekend is. It begins on Fridays at 7 p.m. and it ends on Sundays at 7 p.m. We also have some flexibility for what happens when the child has a day off of school on a given Friday or a given Monday during the 3rd weekend of the month. If they don't have school on Friday during the 3rd weekend, then the parenting time can begin on Thursday at 7. If the child doesn't have school on Monday during the 3rd weekend, then mom can continue her parenting time through Monday at 7 p.m. So these really specific considerations help you clearly define the expectations for the school year versus summer parenting time schedule. Let's go and also talk about holidays. Holidays are really important because you might also want to carve out specific holiday parenting time in order to strike a better balance between the number of overnights allocated to each parent, especially when you're doing the summer versus a school year parenting time schedule. you may consider giving the summertime parent more of the school year holidays each year. So the starred holidays in this list are commonly allocated to the non-majority time parent in order to ensure more regular and frequent contact and to increase the summertime parents' number of overnights in each calendar year. In addition to the holidays listed, you might also want to consider additional 3-day weekends that are not necessarily consistent each year, but tend to arise due to the administrative needs of the school. So often kids get 1 to 2 extra 3-day weekends because of things like teacher work days or furlough days. So that's something else you might want to consider allocating to the non-majority time parent during the school year, so your summertime parent, so that they can spend more time with your child. Also, just as you're specific about defining the beginning and end of the school year and the summer and defining what those weekends look like when you're having those carve outs during the school year, you should very specifically define each holiday. For example, you might define Labor Day as beginning Friday at 7 p.m. and ending Monday at 7 p.m. Then there's no wiggle room, no confusion. And keep in mind, you can always be flexible with your co-parent if you need to change the exchange time. It just is your default in the event that you disagree. Going on to our next consideration, location. I think that people don't think about this often enough. You're asking here, in what state will parenting time be exercised? To some, the answer to this question may seem really obvious, and in certain cases, it is. For example, the school year parent will exercise school year parenting time in that parent's home state. The summertime parent will exercise summer parenting time in that parent's home state. But what about holidays? What about those special carve-out weekends? Will the non-majority time parent travel to the other parent's home state, or will the child be traveling? And your answer to this question can depend on a number of factors. I like to consider, what is the distance that the child is going to have to travel? What's the method of travel? How old is the child and how long is the break? These factors may also impact whether a particular allocation of parenting time will even be made. So for example, if the child is very young and the distance is far and the break is short, maybe parent number 2 won't be getting time for that break. Maybe you have to wait until your child is older or the break is longer in the future. So that's something you need to consider. Where are you going to actually be physically exercising the specific parenting time that's allocated to both parents? Let's see here. We're also going to talk about transportation. This is our third consideration that I definitely want to go through. I would say, number 1, you want to consider the mode of transportation first, which is impacted almost entirely by the distance between your 2 states, your 2 residences. If parent number 1 lives in Fort Collins and parent number 2 lives in Cheyenne, well, that's only a 45-minute or hour-long drive. No one's flying that distance. If you're talking Denver to New York City, that's a different matter altogether. You're probably not going to be making a 27-hour drive. Of course, I've given really extreme examples on both sides of the spectrum for a reason. There are going to be closer calls where this question may be more of a struggle and may be more impacted by cost, availability of flights, and or the age of the child. If you are living 6 hours apart, is it worth it to schedule a flight, or are you going to drive? Age really comes into play. I mentioned that as one of the factors that might impact the mode of transportation, but age, I think, comes into play significantly when you're dealing with a younger child, because you'll have to consider whether a parent will need to fly with a child if you're flying to the second state, whether the child can fly unaccompanied. Each airline has its own rules and about fees, about how old a child has to be before they can fly unaccompanied. And before you agree to a parenting plan that contemplates flying, be sure to do some research into these issues. You may even want to consider an age range and the method of transportation. So for example, if your child is under the age of 9, we always want a parent to be flying with that child. Once the child turns 9, then you can maybe have them flying unaccompanied. And you might want to contemplate that in your parenting plan so you don't have to come back in a couple of years to make a change. The last 2 issues on this list, though, scheduling and the exchange of an itinerary, really come into play when you're dealing with flying. You should be asking a couple different questions when you're dealing with scheduling. Which parent will be responsible for scheduling the child's flight? Does the scheduling parent have to confer with the other parent on the flight time, the airline, the airport, if there's more than one viable option close to the other parent's residence? And then if conferral is going to be required, what's the process? You want to have a plan for if one parent is being unreasonable, so you can get past that obstacle and still schedule the travel to facilitate parenting time. You should also consider, by when should the flight be scheduled? 3 days in advance, 30 days in advance of the parenting time. Pick a deadline. That way you don't run into issues of someone scheduling a change or something like that the night before you expect to be exercising parenting time. Lastly, I think you should consider when you're providing an itinerary to the other parent. So if you're the scheduling parent, you schedule a flight, when should you be sending that flight information to the secondary parent so they can start planning how they're going to pick the kid up from the airport? Our next consideration here is the cost of travel. When dealing with a multi-state parenting plan, there will likely be costs associated with travel that can be significant. This doesn't arise in the Fort Collins Cheyenne example that I raised earlier, as the exchange structure is much more traditional, i.e. both parents will likely equally engage in the transportation and will pay for their own gas, so you don't have to exchange funds. But when we start throwing flights into the mix, I think it's important to talk about the costs that each parent is likely to incur. Most obviously, we have the cost of the flight itself. Additionally, you may have unaccompanied minor fees and baggage costs. A parent might incur costs for parking when dropping the child off at the airport. If a parent is traveling with the child, then that parent has flight costs, and there might also be parking costs if they're going to keep a car for a decent period of time at the airport while they're flying. You will also need to discuss these costs and then determine whether you and your co-parent will be sharing responsibility. And sharing responsibility can be simple, and then it can range to more complex. For example, if parent one pays for the child's flight and associated costs when flying to state 2, and parent number 2 pays for the child's flight and associated costs when flying back to state 1, and we just call it even, then there's no money changing hands. It just might not end up being a 50-50 division strictly, because maybe the first flight is $266 and the second flight is $145. If you want to call it even so you don't have to communicate that frequently, then so be it. You don't have to actually have a procedure for reimbursing costs. If, however, you and your co-parent want to each be responsible for a certain percentage of all costs, you're likely going to need a reimbursement procedure. And what does that look like? Here is an example of some bad language for a reimbursement procedure. It's just too simple. It just says mother and father are going to share the cost of all travel expenses. It's probably not enough, especially if there's going to be a dispute that arises in the future about how you're sharing 50-50 the costs of travel. So let's look at a much better example, which of course is always longer. Let's see. So we have the same first line here, but then we define travel costs. And most importantly, we have the how for the reimbursement process. And we're going to read through that. So we've defined our travel costs. You don't have to define it this way. You can define it however you and your co-parent want. I kind of tried to include everything that could be included with a flight. If we have our reimbursement procedure here, I have our example of dividing 50-50. So we're contemplating that one parent is going to be advancing the cost. So if one parent advances the cost of travel expenses, they shall provide proof of payment to the other parent within 30 days of incurring the expense. The other parent shall reimburse the paying parent for their 50% of the total overall costs within 30 days. If the parent who advances the cost fails to provide proof of payment to the other parent within 30 days, they shall be deemed to have waived their right to reimbursement. This process, I think, is great. Not to toot my own horn, but I think it's great for a couple different reasons. First, it requires an exchange of documentation showing the cost. One parent can't simply text the other saying, I paid for Jimmy's flight. It was $500. Pay me back your half. You have to actually show proof of payment. It also includes, a specific timeline for the reimbursement pay. I don't know why I just struggled over that. It includes a specific timeline for the reimbursing parent to pay the advancing parent back. And if that doesn't happen, you have a concrete language to rely on if you have to ask the court for reimbursement. Finally, the last sentence here protects against a situation where the advancing parent does in fact pay for a flight, but never asks for reimbursement. For example, let's say it's 2 years later, the advancing parent, he says, hey, I've paid for 15 flights. You owe me thousands and thousands of dollars. I'm asking for you a lump sum today that you have to pay, or within 30 days that you have to pay. You got to do it right now. With this language, that parent would be barred from making such a request. So I think that this reimbursement procedure is pretty airtight. The last consideration that we're going to focus on today, not saying that it's the last that could ever come up, but the last that we're going to talk about is exchanges. And I think that this is really important and people don't think about it enough, just like most of the things I've already talked about here today. If a parent is traveling with the child, let's say we have parent 1 picking the child up from parent 2 in state 2, or we have parent 2 going to take the child to parent 1 in state 1. In such a case where a parent is traveling with the child, the definition of the exchange is a little bit more clear because it's actually happening when the parents meet in person and the child goes from parent 1 to parent 2. The transfer of responsibility for the child and his or her well-being is also clearer in these situations because it simply transfers when the child walks between the two parents. If a parent is not traveling with the child, you have to put a lot more thought into this issue. You have to be prepared to address an emergency situation which might arise mid-flight or prior to the flight even taking off. Let's say parent 1 takes the child to the airport, the child gets on the plane, and the plane has an issue and never takes off. I think logically, it makes sense that parent 1 is still responsible for the child's well-being. We're still in parent 1's state. Parent 2 can be across the country. What is parent 2 going to do to help the child? But what about a situation where the plane does take off, but has to land at a midway point because maybe there is a weather issue? Who's responsible for retrieving the child? If we have that Denver, New York example again, let's say the plane has to be grounded in Chicago. Is parent 1 who put the child on the plane responsible for going to Chicago and picking the child up? Or is parent 2, who was going to be the one exercising parenting time, having to go from New York to Chicago to pick the child up and then begin their parenting time? It's an important thing that a lot of people don't plan for. So now you know, and now you're going to plan for it. I think that this question also heavily relates to the issue of transportation and the definitions of parenting time, because you have to consider the takeoff and landing times of your flight. If you define parenting time as beginning after school on Fridays, that's when parent number 2, who's the non-majority parent, is going to begin their parenting time. Does that mean that parent number 2 is able to schedule a flight for the child at 3 p.m. if his school day ends at 2:45 p.m.? Technically, that flight time might be after the child's school day officially ends, but that won't allow the child time to complete the school day and get to the airport. We all know we got to get to the airport 2 hours early to make sure that we're flying appropriately. So little Jimmy, he's not going to be able to get out of school at 2:45 and speed racer down to the airport by 3 p.m. It's not going to happen. But is that appropriate if parent number 2 does that? Or no? You should define that in your parenting plan. Also, will parent number 1 have to take off of work to get the child to the airport? Is that the expectation? That if a flight is scheduled during parent number 1's workday, that they have to take off in order to facilitate and accommodate that flight schedule? If the child will miss school or a parent has to take off of work, you have to ask, is that permissible? Or should there be an additional limitation put in place defining what time is appropriate to schedule a flight? Now, those questions center primarily on whether the scheduled flight will interfere with normal activities like school or work. But what about a red-eye flight? Is it acceptable for the child to be flying at 11 p.m.? You might want to consider an additional limitation or definition about what the range of appropriate flight times is. Okay, so that's a lot of different considerations that we just went through. They're the ones I think that people should be focusing on primarily, where they might not normally want to include those definitions or might not even enter their mind. Of course, like I mentioned, there are a lot of other considerations that might come up in your specific case, depending on your facts, your circumstances. So I'm sure that a lot of people have a lot of other ideas, but those are the things I think people should be keeping in mind when navigating a multi-state parenting time plan. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I just went through, or have any examples they want to throw my way? I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Shannon. So everyone, if you do have any questions, you can type them into the chat box or into the little Q&A box that you see on your screen. And I will read them out to Shannon to ensure that you remain anonymous. The other option is if you do, as Shannon mentioned, have specific questions related to your case, feel free to send us an email. You can email us at info@johnsonlgroup.com and we will send you to Shannon. We will send you to any of our attorneys that might be able to answer your question. And if you have any comments, any, specific topics that you would like us to discuss in any of our upcoming webinars, feel free to send those to us via email as well. As you all are also thinking of questions, feel free to follow us on social media. We have tons of webinars coming up. So you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and keep up to date with all of our events that we have coming up. You will receive a link to all of our social media in a follow-up email to this, or you can just search Johnson Law Group and you will find us and our beautiful green logo. That's how you know it's us. So I'm not seeing any questions, but like I said, feel free to email us. We are always here for you, always happy to answer any questions and help in any way that we can. I actually do have one question. It says, I would need help modifying my parenting plan to all the spoken items, and how much would that cost to get written up by an attorney? So what I'm going to do is I will send this question and the person's contact information to you, Shannon, if that's okay. And you guys can get on a call or correspond via email or anything like that. I think that that might be the easiest option. We do provide free consultation, so Shannon can definitely talk with you and answer your questions and give you an idea of how much that would cost and everything.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to.
All right, so if there are no other questions, thank you everyone for joining, registering, participating. Thank you, Shannon. This was excellent. So much information. Really appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on with me.
Happy to do it. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you guys. Have a good one.